The black dress clung to Clara Meadows like a shroud she wasn't ready to wear, marking her as damaged goods at barely 19. But when Silas Crawford found her crying behind his barn with swollen belly and nowhere to go, the weathered 60-year-old rancher saw past the widow's weeds to something that made his calloused hands tremble. "You're too young to be a widow," he said, his voice rough as frontier whiskey, before his gaze dropped to her rounded middle where another man's child grew, and the words that followed changed everything. "But you're not too young to be my wife. And this baby needs a father who won't leave." The proposition hung between them like a lifeline over a cliff, scandalous and practical, and desperately needed, while the setting sun painted the Texas sky the color of fresh blood and new beginnings. Clara's fingers trembled against the worn leather of her dead husband's photograph as she followed Silas Crawford into the ranch house that would become her refuge, her shame burning hot enough to rival the kerosene lamps he lit against the gathering darkness. The main room stretched before her like a cavern of masculine solitude, every surface coated with the fine dust of neglect that spoke of years without feminine attention, and she could smell the loneliness in the stale air that hadn't known the scent of baking bread or wildflower bouquets in longer than she'd been alive. Silas moved with practiced efficiency through the shadows, his weathered hands steady as he carried her single carpet bag up the wooden stairs that creaked under his weight, and when he pushed open the door to what would be her room, she saw that he'd already prepared it with fresh linens that must have been stored away for decades. "I'm not expecting anything from you except honest work and companionship," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a business transaction, even as his eyes betrayed something deeper, something that recognized her desperation because it matched his own. The bed stood against the far wall like an island of safety, and Clara sank onto its edge, still clutching her husband's image, while her other hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, where life grew despite death's recent visit. Silas paused in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the hallway lamp, and she could see him wrestling with words that wouldn't come, this man old enough to be her grandfather, who had just offered her salvation wrapped in scandal. The house settled around them with small sounds of wood adjusting to the cooling night air, and through the window she could see the vast expanse of his land stretching toward mountains that looked like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. "When morning comes, we'll go to town and make it legal," Silas said finally, his tone suggesting this was merely another chore like mending fences or branding cattle, but Clara caught the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the doorframe. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and watched him retreat to his own room at the opposite end of the hall, the distance between them measured in more than just floorboards, and filled with unspoken questions about what exactly they were beginning. The photograph in her hands showed a young man with bright eyes and an easy smile, who had promised her forever but delivered only 7 months before a logging accident left her with nothing but memories and the child he would never to meet. Now she sat in a stranger's house, about to become a wife again before she'd properly learned to be a widow, trading her grief for security and her youth for the protection of a man whose kindness seemed to cost him something she didn't yet understand. The dust motes continued their lazy dance in the lamplight, and Clara finally set aside the photograph to explore the room that would be hers, finding it furnished with simple but sturdy pieces that spoke of quality and care, waiting patiently for someone to bring them back to life. The whispers started the moment Clara stepped down from Silas's wagon onto the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, her black morning dress stretched tight across her pregnant belly like a scandal made visible, and she could feel the weight of every stare as surely as she felt the baby shift inside her. Mrs. Wellington emerged from the general store like a righteousness made flesh, her face pinched with the kind of disapproval that had probably been fermenting since birth, and Clara watched Silas's jaw tighten as he moved protectively closer, his hand finding the small of her back with a possessiveness that sent more whispers rippling through the gathering crowd. "This is my wife, Clara Crawford, Silas announced to the assembled busybodies with a firmness that brooked no argument, though Clara could see doubt flickering in their eyes as they calculated the decades between them and the obviousness of her condition. Inside the general store, conversations died like prairie grass in drought as they moved through the aisles, Clara's cheeks burning hot enough to light kindling while she selected flour and salt under the watchful eyes of women who had probably planned their own perfect marriages since childhood. "It's indecent, Mrs." Wellington hissed, positioning herself like a guardian angel at the pickle barrel. A girl her age with a man old enough to be her grandfather, and someone should tell the minister about this abomination. Silas's hand tightened on Clara's back, but his voice remained level as he replied that their marriage was legal and blessed, though Clara could see the hurt in his eyes at being reduced to nothing more than his age. The store clerk fumbled with their purchases, clearly torn between the need for business and the desire to participate in the unfolding drama, while outside more townspeople gathered like vultures scenting something dying. When they finally escaped to load their supplies, Clara heard someone mutter about gold diggers and desperate old fools, the words hitting her like physical blows even as she kept her chin raised in defiance of their judgment. The church loomed at the end of the street like a whitewashed jury box, and Clara knew their next Sunday would involve running a gauntlet of prayers for their souls and thinly veiled condemnations dressed as concern. She could already imagine the sermon about appropriate unions and God's plan for marriage, delivered while congregants shot meaningful glances at their pew. But as Silas helped her back onto the wagon seat with a gentleness that belied his rough hands, Clara realized something that steadied her spine against all their disapproval. These people saw only surfaces, the age difference and her swollen belly and the quickness of their union, but they couldn't see the quiet desperation that had brought two lonely souls together, or the tentative hope building between them like a seedling in hard soil. The ride back to the ranch stretched before them in silence, broken only by wagon wheels and horse hooves. But when Silas finally spoke, his words carried a promise that mattered more than any town gossip. "They'll get used to it or they won't," he said simply. "But either way, you're my wife now, and this ranch is your home for as long as you want it." The thunder crashed like God's own fury against the ranch house walls when Clara's water broke 2 months too early, sending amniotic fluid mixing with the rain that leaked through the kitchen ceiling as she gripped the table edge and screamed through the first real contraction that told her this baby wouldn't wait for doctors or proper timing. Silas burst through the door, soaked to the bone from checking the livestock, his face draining of color when he saw her doubled over, and through the window they could both see the creek had become a raging river that cut them off from town and help as surely as if they'd been stranded on an island. "We need to get you comfortable," he said, though his voice shook worse than his hands as he helped her toward the bedroom. But Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that beds were for normal births, and this child was coming fast and wrong. The barn. She gasped between contractions that rolled through her like the thunder overhead, remembering how she'd seen him deliver calves in that space with room to move and hooks for hanging lanterns, and though confusion crossed his weathered features, he didn't argue. Within minutes he had her settled on fresh hay covered with clean blankets while the storm raged outside, transforming their usually peaceful barn into something primitive and frightening as shadows danced across the walls from the swaying lanterns he'd hung from every available beam. "I've birthed 100 calves, but this," Silas whispered as he knelt beside her, his confession hanging between them like another kind of lightning, while Clara gripped his hand hard enough to leave bruises that would last weeks. She could see terror in his eyes that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with memories she didn't yet know about, but there was no time for gentle exploration of past wounds when her body was tearing itself apart to bring forth life. His hands steadied as necessity overtook fear, and Clara watched through pain-blurred vision as this man who'd married her out of pity transformed into something fierce and protective, coaching her through each contraction with the same calm authority he used with laboring cattle, but tempered with a tenderness that made her heart constrict for reasons that had nothing to do with birth pains. The storm peaked as the baby crowned, wind screaming through barn slats while Clara screamed with it, and Silas never faltered, even when blood soaked through the blankets, and his own memories must have been clawing at him like living things. "Push now," he commanded with gentle firmness, his hands positioned to catch new life while rain hammered the roof like applause, and Clara bore down with everything she had left, while lightning illuminated the barn in stark white flashes that made everything seem like a dream or nightmare, or both. The baby emerged in a rush of fluid and blood, tiny and purple and terrifyingly still, and Clara watched Silas work with desperate efficiency to clear airways and stimulate breathing, while his lips moved in what might have been prayer or promises or both. When that first thin wail finally pierced the storm's noise, Silas's shoulders shook with silent sobs as he wrapped the impossibly small infant in clean towels and placed her against Clara's chest, his hands infinitely gentle as they adjusted the blankets to keep them both warm, while the storm began its slow retreat toward the mountains. The baby weighed less than a barn cat and breathed like she was drowning in air itself, each tiny chest movement, a battle that Silas fought alongside her for 3 days straight without sleep, his bloodshot eyes never leaving the warming box he'd fashioned from a wooden crate and heated stones wrapped in flannel. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness from blood loss and exhaustion, but every time she woke, she found him there, dropping sugar water onto those impossibly small lips with a medicine dropper, or adjusting the temperature of the stones with the precision of a man diffusing explosives. He'd moved them both into what had been the empty nursery, transforming it hour by hour as he worked, hanging wet sheets to keep the air moist and positioning mirrors to catch and direct sunlight onto the baby during the brief moments when clouds parted. The child wasn't even supposed to be his, belonged to a dead man he'd never met, yet Clara watched through tear-blurred eyes as Silas handled her with the reverence reserved for holy relics, his massive hands infinitely gentle, as they massaged her chest to help her breathe or cleaned her when she soiled the soft cloths he'd torn from his own shirts. "She's a fighter like her mama," he murmured during one of those endless nights, and Clara's heart seized at the words because he hadn't said like you but like her mama, claiming them both with a possessiveness that had nothing to do with legal documents and everything to do with choice. On the second day, when the baby's breathing grew so shallow, Clara could barely see her chest move, Silas fashioned a tiny feeding tube from a hollow reed and began dripping Clara's expressed milk directly into the infant's stomach, a technique he'd learned from raising orphaned calves, but adapted with an inventiveness born of desperation. The room filled with his handiwork as the hours passed, a rocking chair he carved while keeping vigil, shelves that appeared between feeding sessions, a mobile made from whittled birds that would catch the light and give the baby something to focus on if she survived to see it. Clara tried to help but could barely sit up without the room spinning, so she watched this man who'd been a stranger just weeks ago pour himself into keeping her daughter alive, with a dedication that made her wonder what ghosts drove him to fight death so fiercely. The local women would have called it unseemly, a man his age tending to female matters, but Clara saw only beauty in how he held the baby against his bare chest for warmth when the stones cooled too quickly, his grey chest hair tickling her translucent skin while he hummed lullabies remembered from some distant past. By the third night, when the baby's colour finally shifted from blue to pink and her breathing deepened into something that resembled normal sleep, Silas collapsed into the rocking chair, still cradling her against his chest, and Clara watched them both sleep while tears rolled down her cheeks for this man who had saved them both. She understood now that their marriage might have begun as a transaction, but somewhere between the storm and this endless vigil, it had transformed into something neither of them had expected, a bond forged in fear, and sealed with the kind of love that comes from choosing to fight for something together. Clara found the photographs by accident while searching for writing paper in Silas's study at midnight, unable to sleep from worry over the baby's laboured breathing, and the images that stared back at her from the dusty album made her legs give out beneath her as understanding crashed over her like a physical blow. A young woman with gentle eyes held an infant in a christening gown, both frozen in sepia-toned perfection, and the date scrawled on the back in Silas's careful hand was exactly 20 years ago next month, making Clara realize with sickening clarity why he'd fought so hard to save her premature daughter. She heard his footsteps on the stairs before she could return the album to its hiding place. And when he appeared in the doorway holding a fresh bottle for the baby, his face crumbled at the sight of those photographs spread across his desk like evidence of a crime he'd never confessed. The silence stretched between them until it became unbearable, the room's shadows making him look every one of his 60 years as he sank into the leather chair across from her, his hands trembling worse than they had during the birth as he reached for the image of his dead wife and child. "Martha was her name," he said, his voice breaking on the syllables like they were made of glass. "And our daughter lived for exactly 3 hours before I watched her turn blue in her mother's arms while I ran for a doctor who wouldn't have made it in time anyway." The lamp flame flickered as if responding to his grief, casting dancing shadows that made the photograph seem to move, and Clara found herself holding her breath as this strong man who'd been her rock finally shattered before her eyes. "I couldn't save them," he continued, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks into his grey beard. "Watch them both die in the same bed where you sleep now. Martha bleeding out while begging me to save the baby I'd already lost. And I've spent 20 years wondering what I did wrong." Clara wanted to comfort him but felt frozen by the weight of revelation, understanding now why he'd moved her to the barn during labor, why he'd stayed awake for days fighting for a baby that wasn't even his, why his hands had shaken with more than just fear during those critical hours. "When I saw you behind my barn that day, pregnant and scared and alone," Silas whispered, "I thought God was giving me another chance to get it right. A chance to save what I couldn't save before, to prove I wasn't the failure who let his family die." The confession hung in the midnight air like smoke from the lamp, and Clara suddenly saw their entire arrangement differently. Not a simple transaction between desperate souls, but a complex web of grief and hope, and the terrible weight of trying to rewrite the past through present actions. She moved around the desk slowly, kneeling beside his chair, and taking his shaking hands in her smaller ones, feeling the calluses and scars of 20 years spent working himself into exhaustion rather than facing the ghosts that lived in this house. "You didn't let them die," she said softly, knowing the words wouldn't heal decades of self-torture, but needing to say them anyway. "Sometimes babies come too early and mothers bleed too much, and all the love in the world can't change that. But you saved us, Silas. You saved my daughter when another man might have let nature take its course, and that has to count for something." The weeks following his confession became a tapestry of small intimacies woven through their daily routines, each shared meal and quiet evening adding threads to something neither of them quite dared to name, as Clara taught Silas lullabies her own mother had sung, while he showed her how to read the land for signs of weather and water. They developed a rhythm as natural as breathing, Clara preparing breakfast while Silas fed the baby her first bottle, their movements synchronized without discussion as they passed between kitchen and nursery, their fingers brushing in these exchanges with increasing frequency and decreasing accident. During afternoon feedings, Silas would settle in the rocking chair while Clara perched on the footstool beside him, teaching him the words to songs he hummed but had forgotten, her voice mixing with his deeper tones until the baby would stop fussing and stare at them both with unfocused eyes that seemed to see everything. The ranch work became their classroom for a different kind of learning, Clara following Silas through pastures as he explained rotation patterns and water rights while she carried the baby in a sling across her chest, asking questions that made him reconsider practices he'd followed for decades without thought. Their evenings transformed from silent meals to conversations that stretched past sunset, discussing everything from cattle prices to Clara's memories of her father teaching her to read by lamplight, the kind of meandering talks that revealed character through accumulated details rather than grand declarations. The kitchen became their favorite space as days shortened toward winter, Clara teaching Silas to bake bread while he repaired harnesses at the table, flower dust floating between them in afternoon light that turned everything golden and dreamlike. It was in that same kitchen, on an ordinary Tuesday when the baby laughed for the first time, that everything shifted between them with the suddenness of a season changing. The sound was barely more than a gurgle, but it stopped them both mid-motion, Clara holding a mixing spoon while Silas looked up from the ledger he'd been updating, and their eyes met across the room with shared wonder at this tiny miracle. Without thought or plan, they moved toward each other and the baby, meeting at the bassinet where their daughter lay grinning toothlessly at whatever infant mystery had amused her, and in their joy Silas cupped Clara's face and kissed her with the naturalness of rain finding earth. The moment lasted only seconds before they both pulled back. Startled by their own actions, the flower from Clara's hands leaving white fingerprints on his cheeks, while his lips tingled with the taste of vanilla from her baking. "I didn't mean to," Silas stammered, colour rising above his beard while he stepped backward. "I'm sorry. I forgot myself in the moment and had no right to presume." But Clara caught his hand before he could retreat further, her own heart hammering with something that felt dangerously close to hope as she looked up at this man who had become so much more than a convenient arrangement. "I'm not," she said simply, watching understanding dawn in his eyes. "I'm not sorry at all, and haven't been for weeks now, if I'm honest." The baby cooed between them, unaware she had just changed everything, while flower continued to drift through the golden light like snow that would never melt, marking the moment when their marriage began its transformation from paper into promise. The knock came at dawn like Judgment Day, arriving early. 3 sharp raps that shattered the peaceful morning as Clara nursed the baby in the kitchen while Silas repaired a bridle at the table, both of them frozen by the unmistakable sound of authority demanding entry. Through the window, Clara could see a black carriage that didn't belong on their dusty ranch road, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the stern profile of her dead husband's brother, Charles, accompanied by his wife Margaret and a man who could only be their lawyer given his city clothes and predatory bearing. Silas rose slowly, his hand finding Clara's shoulder in a gesture of reassurance before he opened the door to face whatever storm had found them, though Clara could see the tension in his spine that said he already suspected this visit brought nothing good. Charles Harmon pushed past Silas without invitation, his eyes scanning the modest room before landing on Clara and the baby, with a possessiveness that made her clutch her daughter tighter against her chest, while Margaret's gaze catalogued every detail, like evidence for a trial they'd already decided. "We've come for James's child and his widow," Charles announced without preamble, producing a sheaf of legal documents with the flourish of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and paperwork. "The pension from James's death belongs to his family, and that child needs to be raised by blood relatives, not by whatever arrangement you've cobbled together here." The lawyer stepped forward with calculated precision, spreading papers across the kitchen table where moments before there had been only peace and bridal leather, his voice carrying the oiled smoothness of practiced threats. "Your marriage to Mr. Crawford appears remarkably convenient, occurring mere days after young Clara arrived carrying the Harmon heir, which suggests a transaction rather than a union, something the courts would find very interesting when determining custody and financial matters." Clara felt the baby sense her distress and begin to fuss, small whimpers escalating toward full cries as the room filled with hostile energy. But before she could speak, Silas moved between her and the intruders with the solid certainty of a man who'd found his line in the sand. "She's my wife, and that's my daughter," he said, each word dropping like a hammer strike into the tense silence. "And you'll have to go through me before you take either of them anywhere." The declaration hung in the air while Margaret gasped at the audacity of this old rancher claiming their blood, but Clara saw something in Silas's stance that she'd witnessed only once before, during the birth when he'd fought death itself for a child that wasn't technically his. "This sham marriage won't hold up under scrutiny," the lawyer interjected, pulling out more documents that bore official seals and threatened consequences, "especially when we present evidence of the suspicious timing and the age difference that suggests exploitation of a vulnerable young widow. But even as threats filled the air like poisonous smoke, Clara found her voice rising above the baby's cries, and the men's posturing, standing despite her shaking knees to face the family that had ignored her existence until money and property entered the equation. "You want to talk about exploitation?" she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Then let's discuss how you turned away when James died. How you offered no help to his pregnant wife, how you only appeared when you learned about the pension, and how you dare stand in my home threatening the man who saved both our lives." The courthouse steps seemed steeper than any mountain Clara had ever imagined climbing as she ascended them 6 months later, her hand tucked firmly in Silas's weathered one, while her heart hammered against her ribs with the knowledge that everything they'd built together would be decided by strangers in a room that smelled of old wood and older laws. The baby, now sturdy enough to sit up on her own, gurgled happily in Silas's other arm, blissfully unaware that her future hung in the balance of testimony and legal precedent, her chubby fingers playing with his beard as if this were any other morning. Inside the courtroom, Charles and Margaret Harmon sat rigid with righteousness behind their expensive lawyer, but Clara noticed how their eyes kept sliding away from the sight of Silas, gently bouncing the baby to keep her content, unable to maintain their moral superiority in the face of such obvious paternal devotion. When Clara took the stand, her voice started out shaking like autumn leaves, but as she began describing their life together, the words flowed stronger and truer, painting a picture of partnership that had grown from desperate necessity into something neither of them had dared hope for. She spoke of midnight feedings where Silas sang lullabies in his cracked voice, of teaching him to braid the baby's growing hair while he showed her how to read weather signs in cloud formations, of the moment she realized that somewhere between shared struggles and small victories, she had fallen completely in love with this man who'd saved them both. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, listened without interruption until Clara reached the part about their kiss in the kitchen, and then she asked the question that made the whole courtroom hold its breath. "Mrs. Crawford, are you testifying that this marriage, which began as an arrangement, has become genuine?" Clara's answer came without hesitation, her eyes finding Silas across the room where he sat cradling their daughter with infinite tenderness. "Your Honor, I'm testifying that I cannot imagine my life without him, that he's shown me what real love looks like through actions rather than words, and that any child would be blessed to call him father." The ruling came after deliberation that felt like centuries but lasted only an hour, the judge declaring that the evidence clearly showed a loving family unit that served the child's best interests, regardless of how that family had formed, and that blood relation mattered less than the daily acts of care she had witnessed. Charles and Margaret left the courthouse with their expensive lawyer and their empty hands, their faces pinched with the kind of defeat that comes from discovering money cannot buy what matters most, while Clara and Silas stood on those same steps they'd climbed in fear, now holding their daughter between them in triumph. 2 years later, on an afternoon when wildflowers painted the meadow in impossible colours, Clara stood at the paddock fence with her hand resting on her swollen belly, where Silas's child grew strong and certain, watching him teach their daughter to sit properly on the gentle mare they'd bought for her 3rd birthday. The little girl shrieked with delight as the horse walked in careful circles, her dark hair flying behind her like a banner, while Silas jogged alongside with protective hands ready to catch her if she wobbled, his face glowing with the kind of joy that had replaced all those shadows from 20 years of guilt. "You gave me back my life," Clara said when he finally lifted their tired daughter from the saddle and joined her at the fence, his hand immediately finding her belly to feel the baby kick, but Silas shook his head, pulling both her and their daughter into an embrace that smelled of horses and hay and home. "No," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "We saved each other, and we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives.